This is called wisdom. And last, number 8, the 8th aspect is to refrain from idle talk. This means to go beyond discriminatory thinking and realize the true nature of all things. The Buddha said, monks, when you engage in various kinds of idle talk, your minds are disturbed. Even though you have already left home, you still are not liberated. Therefore, you must quickly abandon mind-disturbing, idle talk. If you wish to attain the joy of the extinction of suffering, then simply extinguish the affliction of idle talk. This is called avoiding idle talk. So here we have 2 short paragraphs. One again is almost a quote from the Buddha from this sutra, the Sutra of the Buddha's Last Teaching. In conclusion, the Buddha said, monks, seek earnestly for the way. For all worldly things are subject to destruction and decay. Monks, stop talking for a while, for time is slipping away, and I am about to die. These are my last words. And Dogen has just a little bit more to say. There's only one paragraph I have here on this piece of paper. He says, now you can see, hear, and practice these 8 aspects of enlightenment because of the merit of your past good deeds. By practicing and nurturing these awakenings, birth after birth, you can certainly arrive at unsurpassable enlightenment and expound these 8 aspects of awakening to all beings, just as Shakyamuni Buddha did. So he is saying, he's verifying that everybody here has the potential to awaken to our true nature. Now, let me read one more thing. I usually don't do all this reading, but as I mentioned earlier, here we are, a group of people coming from various different traditions, and we're thinking of the Buddha, Shakyamuni Buddha today. And it could be said here that if we wanted to summarize this teaching of the Buddha's last teaching, don't be greedy and don't be angry. Those 2 things. And here's one paragraph, one teaching about anger that comes before these 8 aspects that I just read. So I would like to read this thing about anger. Again, this is the Buddha speaking. Monks, even if a man comes to you and cuts you up limb by limb, you must still keep your mind settled and refrain from anger. Just keep your mouth closed and do not abuse other people. If you lose control and get angry, you will disturb your own practice and lose the benefits of all your virtuous deeds. Indeed, anger is said to destroy all virtuous deeds like that. Of all the precepts or any kind of ascetic training, nothing can match the virtue of forbearance. One who can really persevere and is patient is called an enlightened being. A person who cannot drink the poison of insult with joy and forbearance does not deserve the name of wise man of the way. This is because the damage caused by anger destroys the true Dharma as well as the reputation of the Sangha. No one of this life or future lives wants to meet anger. You must know that anger is worse than ferocious fire. Be careful to protect yourself from it. Don't give in to it. Anger devastates virtue more than anything else. Even a white-robed, desirous person who doesn't follow the way or live according to the Dharma must soothe anger. It is impossible then that a monk, a desireless man of the Dharma, could get angry, just as it is impossible that thunder and lightning could burst forth from a pure white cloud. So those are the teachings that that I wanted to share with you from the Buddha. We are here today to honor the Buddha's teaching, of course, his birth, death, and enlightenment. I think these are timely teachings, but one thing that does occur to me, that even if we hear these teachings, and my teacher, he always encouraged us to keep this sutra nearby. At the monastery where I lived for many years in Japan, we read this sutra 2 weeks before we commemorated the death of the Buddha. As I mentioned earlier, that was on February 15th. However, we lived in a cold area of Japan, and for that reason, the temples in that area all celebrated, or commemorated is probably a better word, the death of the Buddha 1 month later. I always thought, that's great, to have that flexibility, to be able to just move it 1 month later. But anyway, 2 months before that ceremony, 2 weeks before that ceremony, we read this sutra, half of it every other day. So we associate this sutra with the death of the Buddha. Furthermore, just for your interest, this Buddha in our tradition, this sutra in our tradition is read when a person dies. It's called the Pillow Sutra. So when a person dies in our tradition, a monk would go to the home of that person and read the sutra of the Buddha's last teaching. But what occurs to me is, even if we've memorized the sutra, that does not mean that we can practice it. It's one thing for us to hear the teaching, but how are we going to put it into practice? This is the important part of Buddhism, I believe, because Buddhism is a matter of practice, right? And I think we know from human history. I mean, the Buddha lived 2,500 years ago. That may seem like a long time or not. Lately I've been reading books which take the big view, the billion-year view. In that sense, 2,500 years is just a snap of the fingers. But in terms of our life on this planet, in terms of history, and of course Buddhism and religion as we know it, it's a rather long time. But in this day and age, we know that people are having difficulty practicing those two basic things. Don't be angry and don't be greedy. In Buddhism, we often say that greed, anger, and ignorance are the cause of suffering. Sometimes those are rendered as greed, hate, and delusion. You see there's some overlap there in those: greed, anger, and ignorance, greed, hate, and delusion. Those are the three poisons. And really, Buddhist practice is a matter of bringing an end to those poisons. Those are the things that, first of all, cause suffering in our life, but they also cause suffering in other people's lives. But how to do that? And here I want to say that it's going to take desire. It's going to take that aspiration to realize it. I don't think that's going to happen just by itself. Just by someone listening to someone read these things, for example. Or if you go home later and read the sutra, or read books about Buddhism. The question is, how can we really put it into practice? You know, I'm not the kind of person who refers too much to modern day problems, but we are facing immense problems. Think about climate change, for example. Right? I'm presuming all of you have heard about climate change, right? And how it might affect us. This is something that's going to affect, within the next 20 or 30 years, they say, everybody's lives are going to be affected. Even now with this unsettled weather we're having through the Midwest and in the Southeast, record-breaking heat, whether we like it or not, we're going to be forced to change the way we live our lives. We are going to be forced to live with less, I believe. So this is a place to start. Not to be greedy. To know contentment with what is enough. To really know what is enough. That I don't need to have this much more. And I also want to say, I don't think Buddhism is there to say, hey, you have too much. I don't think that. I think a large part of that is something we have to look and say, do I need that? That is large, a personal decision, although as I say, I believe 20, 30 years time, things are going to change rather remarkably in this world, such that we are not going to be able to live with some of those things that we really thought, did I need that swimming pool? Did I need that second, third car, second, third house? Well, I think reality is going to tell us that we don't need all of those things. But what I want to say is the desire of itself is neither good nor bad. To have that aspiration to realize the way, as the Buddha says, seek earnestly for the way. That is something that requires a desire, an aspiration. That's something that we bring to the table. This is not something, at least in my tradition, we don't believe that's something that's going to happen just by itself. Desire works as a poison when we are used by desires. And if, like it or not, that is often what happens. We become addicted to one of these desires. They could always be changed. And they control our life in a way that becomes poisonous. And yet, if we are able to use desire well, that's not necessarily an easy thing to do, but I would like to offer that as a possibility. Finally, I would like to introduce one more teaching by Dogen Zenji, who's, as I explained earlier, is the founder of the Soto sect in Japan. So here I'm introducing a teaching that I believe Dogen Zenji had the awakening of the Buddha. And this is probably his best known teaching, where he clearly explains what has to be done in terms of realizing the way, of attaining realization. He said, to study the way of Buddha is to study the self. A rather remarkable teaching. I always think that's a rather modern way of putting it. Right? Study the self. And then he continues. To study the self is to forget the self. And I often think people might wonder, how can you study the self if you forget it? Or, if I forget the self, how can I study it? And the easy way to understand that, I believe, is that he's referring to two different forms of the self. When he says study the self, he's saying study the self that's one with all things. In the Zen tradition, we say that Zen is the teaching pointing at the underlying oneness of all things. That's the universal self, where there is no separation between self and other. So study that self. And the way to do that is by forgetting the ego. The ego is that sense of me that we all have, that sense of me that we don't remember when we were born. Right? Nobody remembers when they were born. Nobody will know that they're dead. At least according to my tradition. I'm not sure how these other monastics, we're going to hear later what they think about that. But that thing that we think of as me That's what we think of as a symbolic self. That's the ego. From the Buddhist tradition, in the Soto tradition, that is a delusion. That self is really just an idea. To forget the ego, and then Dogen continues, to forget the ego, that small self, is to be enlightened by all things. If we are able to truly see the true nature of the self, then whatever we see, hear, smell, taste, touch, and think is the self. We are always one, in other words, with our environment. That is liberation. That is to be a Buddha. That is to be free of suffering. To be enlightened by all things, he says, is to cast off body and mind of self and others. Then all trace of enlightenment disappears and continues without end. That traceless enlightenment continues without end. Such a beautiful, succinct way of expressing, from our point of view, from the Soto Zen point of view, of what's involved with the practice and realization of Buddhism. I think I'm going to end there. I think I have a few more minutes, but why not end a little early? Is that okay? Okay, thank you so much for listening. Thanks for being here, by the way. And thanks again to Master Jiro and the Sangha from Baba, because it's a big deal to put this on. They've done a lot of work to host this event. And I'm going to take a seat over there. I'm not sure how we're going to do the question and answer part, but we'll figure it out.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much.